Our final speaker, I'm happy to say, was once what many of you are now. She is a former student of West Virginia University. She's one of our alums. Chelsea Fuller joined the Advancement Project, which is what she works with now, as the Senior Communications Associate for Youth Criminalization in June 2015. In this role, Chelsea works to monitor and deconstruct harmful narratives pertaining to our nation's youth of color, while providing strategic communication support and training to grassroots organizations and other institutions engaged in the fight to end the criminalization of Black and brown youth. Prior to joining the Advancement Project, Chelsea was an Alfred Fleischman Diversity Fellow at Fleischman Hillard International Communications in Washington, D.C., where she was a member of the firm's public affairs team. Chelsea holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in news editorial journalism and Africana Studies from West Virginia University, and a Master of Arts in Strategic Communications from American University. Please help me welcome Chelsea Fuller.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Susan, for inviting me, and I have to thank my fellow presenters, Amy and Jessica, for setting the bar very high with their presentations, but also for the work that you're doing here at WVU to educate people about the realities of capital punishment crime and what it means to talk and dissect those systems, so thank you guys as well. So I'm very happy to be here this evening as an alum. I always, appreciate and feel very blessed to have opportunities not only to come back, but to combine my passion for my work with my love for WVU, so I'm really thrilled to be here. So my colleagues really did an amazing job of kind of walking us through what capital punishment really is systematically and what the kind of transitions have been from, guillotines to the different types of executions that we see today, from, the actual execution of people through the electric chair to lethal injection. But what I'm hoping to do with you all tonight, what my role is going to be here tonight is to bring us kind of into the present day to talk about, what these systems actually look like in terms of the people who are incarcerated, the people that are walking death row, as we like to say, the people who are actually facing capital punishment, and actually how we got there. So I'm hoping to humanize these people a little bit and have kind of an open and honest dialogue with you this evening. So in this conversation, we'll address a few of the themes that Bryan Stevenson addresses in his book, Just Mercy, which, if you have not finished it, is quite an impactful read. And those themes are race, punishment, and justice. So tonight, I kind of want to round out the conversation by looking at what exists when we dive into the intersections of race, criminal justice, capital punishment, and all of these things that are outlined in the book. And I think that we need to take here tonight, but also kind of institutionally, nationally, a deeper dive into what lies in the histories of incarceration, capital punishment, and state violence here in the United States. So this was the very basic, the simplest definition of justice that I could find when preparing for this presentation, which is: justice is the process or result of using laws to fairly judge and punish crimes and criminals. So I want us to meditate on this for a little bit, well, for you to meditate on it a little bit as I talk through some facts and some information, and then I want us to challenge ourselves to readdress it at the end of the presentation. So we're gonna go ahead and just get started. And when we're thinking about justice, I want us to also be critical of ourselves and push ourselves to ask what justice really looks like for us as a nation, what it looks like for the most vulnerable in our communities, and what does it look like when we're trying to pair justice with an appropriate punishment for somebody who has committed a crime. So in Just Mercy, Bryan Stevenson mentions that between 1990 and 2005, a new prison was built every day, every 10 days. That is quite a staggering figure, and we know that those who are in the business of capitalizing on the criminalization of the most vulnerable are not only keeping track of the number of prisons that they're building for monetary purposes, but they're doing things like monitoring the birth rates of members of these vulnerable communities that we'll speak a little bit about. They're monitoring the attrition rates of students in schools. They're monitoring classroom attendance to see how many jail cells they need to build in detention centers and juvenile facilities. And that's a very staggering thing if you think about it. It's a very disheartening thing if you actually take a deep look into what it means that folks are looking at our classrooms. They're looking at our youngest and most vulnerable people, our children, to determine what our jail cells, should look like, how many jails we'll actually need in a certain period of time or in a particular area. So moving forward, from 1980, and I'm not going to read all of these verbatim because I kind of want to get through it and get to the real meat of it, but it's important to highlight that from 1980 to 2008, the number of people incarcerated in America quadrupled from roughly 500,000 to 2.3 million people. And it's important to note that in that 2.3 million, 1 million of those people are Black or peoples of African descent. So today in the US, we have roughly 5% of the world's incarcerated population. That's really a lot if you think about it. So we have 5% of the world population, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. And if we're looking at the demographics in this country and the ratios of people who are incarcerated, we know that the majority of the folks who make up the composition of our prison systems and of death row are people of color and those that live on the margins. So that really says a lot about our society if we think about it. And when we're talking about prisons and jails comprehensively, we know that we're not only talking about those who are physically incarcerated in jails or in cells, we're talking about people who are in prison. We're talking about people who are on probation, who are under supervisory watch or probationary periods of time where they're being monitored. So 1 in every 31 adults, or 3.2% of the population, is under some form of correctional control. So within all of these facts, what it leads us to know and to understand is that incarceration has become almost an answer to everything you could think of in this country. We're using incarceration to deal with health problems like drug addiction. We're using it to deal with poverty, child behavioral disorders, and school discipline issues, and we're also using it to deal with immigration at this point. So sending people to prison is just as, if not more profitable than most of our nation's most booming industries. So we know from recent data, some compiled by the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, that about $70 billion roughly is spent on corrections annually, and my colleague spoke to that slightly as well. We're spending a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer resources to incarcerate people for crimes that some might be worthwhile, others we don't really know. And some we know are not actually justifiable by prison or in forms of incarceration or by death. So within that $70 million being spent annually, we also know that roughly around $200 million is being spent annually on public safety. So that's anywhere from $200 million being spent on police training, on incarceration, upkeep in terms of jail upkeep, prison, with redevelopment, where they're taking prisons from, out of date models of jail cells or whatever, and upgrading them to be top of the line, high capacity prisons. So that's also a lot of taxpayer money, like our colleagues were saying, that's being spent on punishment in the realest sense of the word. So what we also know is that death row, I need this thing to get it together. Okay. What we also know is that within conversations about incarceration and death row, that the demographics of people often look very similar to those of just, non-death row related institutions or people that are not serving life in prison. Those numbers look very similar to those who are just serving time for low offense crimes. So since 1976, 1,437 people have been executed by way of capital punishment in this country. In terms of region, we know that executions primarily in this day and age are occurring in the South, and if I'm not mistaken, Texas is leading the way in executions as of today. There have been around 1,262 lethal injections since 1976, which is quite a large number if you think about it, and the nation's leading method of execution is still lethal injection, as my colleague mentioned during her presentation. So some other statistics about death row currently today deal with women and juveniles. I won't belabor and go through those, but I think just to provide some context for how women and young people fall within that system, about 22 defendants have been executed for crimes committed as juveniles since 1976, but in 2005, the Supreme Court in Roper versus Simmons struck down the death penalty for juveniles, which was a tremendous success, and Bryan Stevenson was actually a tremendous part of that process. But since 1976, there have been 22 young people that were put to death by capital punishment. In terms of women, 16 women have been executed since 1976, and then around 2014, which is the most recent data around women incarceration and capital punishment that we had available to us at the Advancement Project, 56 women have been on death row since 2014. So that constitutes about 2% of the death row population. So recent data compiled by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund's most recent Death Row USA report shows us that approximately 44% of today's death row population in terms of inmates are white or non-ethnic people. 43% are black, 10% are Latinx or fall within the Hispanic identifier, and 3% identify as other. So these numbers are staggering, or they're a staggering indication of the disparate interaction communities of color have with police. And they're disparate in the sense that we know that today in the US that black people are only roughly about 13.2% of the total population, with non-Hispanic whites making up approximately 62.6%. So while the statistics, are showing that whites are actually receiving the death penalty at a higher rate, we know that the ratio of blacks in reference to population is much higher. So you can't have a presentation without the beloved text-heavy research slide. So this is mine. I will not read all of this to you, but what this information lets us know is that black defendants across the board are more likely to be recommended for a death sentence than white defendants. Those who kill white people are more likely to be sentenced to death than those who kill black or non-white people. And patterns of discrimination found in our criminal justice system, particularly in the decision-making processes for those who would receive capital punishment, are far more likely to receive discrimination to receive discrimination if the person being charged is black as opposed to if they were white. So if anybody, for class purposes, or if my colleagues, if you're interested in any of this data, which you probably already have, feel free to reach out to me, but we can't read all that. That's just way too much. So that is the lovely Bryan Stevenson, for those of you who have not met him. So the numbers and the research that my colleagues have talked about, that I've rambled through quickly in the sake of time, tell us that the majority of people in our prison system are people of color, that there is a disparate number of people facing execution in this country, and those people are people of color and those living on the margins. And we also know that the majority of people who have been up for exoneration, or folks who have had the opportunity to have their charges overturned and have been freed from jail, have also been people of color and those living in underserved communities. So that in and of itself kind of says a lot. We know that there's one other consistency that has flown through all of these institutions since their creation, and that's poverty. So some people ask the question, well, why is that? Why is it that, the people that are making up our prison system, that are facing, these horrible conditions in terms of being up for capital punishment, why are they people of color? Why are they consistently people without access to resources, without access to education? And some would say, that poor people and people of color are just more inclined to criminal activity because of the environments that they live in and the choices that they make, their personal choices. But we know the narratives around people of color and criminalization, right? Like, we know that particularly our young people are viewed as less innocent, are viewed as less deserving of forgiveness and of mercy and of justice, and that the decisions that they're making that are bringing harm are right. If you are making decisions that would bring you into an encounter with a police officer, then you must have done something to deserve that. And there are some of us, many of us who act as conspirators in the fight for freedom and justice and liberation, like Bryan Stevenson, would argue that that is not always true. And many times where it's people of color and those living in underserved communities, we know that that is absolutely 90% of the time not true. So just to be clear, I believe that people should be punished for the crimes that they commit. And as my colleague talked about retribution and some of the actual policies that are outlined in terms of what the purpose of capital punishment is, I do believe that people should be punished for the crimes they commit against society, against one another, as brothers and sisters, as citizens of the United States. However, I believe that punishment should be proportional to the severity of the crime. But the question that I want to ask you is, what about the people who find themselves trapped in these systems, find themselves incarcerated, find themselves walking death row without representation, finding themselves facing the end of their lives, and these people's only crime has been that they were black, that they were brown, that they didn't have access to education, that they didn't have access to quality of life resources. What happens to the people that are differently abled, that find themselves in these institutions without representation? What happens to those people who fall through the cracks, and those folks who have a high probability of having experienced extreme criminalization or oppression at some point in their life before that encounter that resulted in the end of their freedom, that encounter with a police officer, that encounter with the criminal justice system that locked them up and took away their access to navigate society. So it's my belief that we cannot jump into conversations about crime, about jails, and about punishment without acknowledging that it starts with interactions with law enforcement and that vulnerable communities. And when I say that, I'm talking about black people, brown people, I'm talking about those who are differently abled, those who are without access to quality of life resources, like I said. What happens when we're talking about these issues without acknowledging those people, without humanizing these instances, these issues that we're talking about? We leave out the voices of the most impacted, the people who need to be discussed the most in terms of this conversation. So we know that interactions with law enforcement are more likely in underserved communities, and where people of color are concerned, there are increased rates of law enforcement. We know that to be true. And I think after all that we've witnessed over the past few years, from Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown to Rekia Boyd, and some even many countless names preceding those tragic deaths. And I think that we can honestly say here tonight that long before those names were known, and long before we started having intentional conversations about what it means to be a person of color, what it means to have interactions with law enforcement in this day, in this age, and in this society, when we're talking about what justice looks like, I think it would be hard to deny that discrimination is an issue that's underlying all of these issues that we've been talking about tonight and that fall within this conversation of punishment and justice. We're talking about the unrelenting attacks on black and brown bodies. We're talking about zero tolerance policies that have locked people up for generations for small, low-level offenses like traffic stops and running red lights. We're talking about the presence of armed police in our schools that are not there to prevent harm that would come from a mass shooter. And even though we have experienced that as a nation and it has been a tragedy, we know 9 times out of 10 when schools are spending more resources on police officers and armed security guards in low-income and underserved communities, they're not doing so to prevent a mass shooting. They're doing so for the reasons that we talked about before, to continue funneling students into what we know to be the school-to-prison pipeline. And this isn't to disparage or talk badly about the armed men and women who serve our country and who are in our schools to truly prevent harm, but that is not the reality for many young people in this country, for many people of color in this country, and we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that. So we know that, modern-day police, we know where modern-day police derive from, I'm hoping, because it's hard to have conversations about justice and punishment if you're not understanding and acknowledging the origins of the systems that function within them or the systems that allow them to perpetuate, right? So we know that modern-day police derive from slave patrols. Oops. slave patrols that, were tagged along with night watches that were, very prevalent in the pre and post Reconstruction eras. They were created to both, control the population of minority people. They were created to control the behaviors and the actions of people of color, but more so they were created to maintain the status quo for people in power. And at that time, we know that percentage or population of people that had the power to make choices for the populations that they were living in were white men primarily. So now fast forward, 100 years, 150 years later, and we see that horse-drawn, paddy wagons filled with torch-bearing Klan members. That's not the visual, that's not the image that we see today, but the actions are very similar. They've been replaced with, suited armed police officers that are offering people rough rides and shots in the back instead of lynchings and public beatings and guillotine executions and very public, brutalized forms of taking someone's life. Bryan Stevenson, in his book, talks at length about the origins of capital punishment and has dedicated himself truly to educating people about how America's history of lynching is actually a huge part of our current problem related to state violence. So I want to share an excerpt from something that I wrote after spending some time with Mr. Stevenson in Montgomery, Alabama. Last spring, I traveled there to spend a weekend with Mr. Stevenson and a select group of civil rights advocates and leaders and faith leaders from across the country at the Equal Justice Initiative. The purpose was to get us together to talk about how we could bring our work together and package it in a way that we could share with faith leaders across the country so that we could bring some of these really hard issues into congregations and have open and honest dialogue about justice, about punishment, about crime and criminalization in our communities. So on the second day of that trip, it was a very long day. Bryan loaded us up onto some buses and said, we're going to go and I'm going to allow you to participate in something that's very near and dear to my heart. And he was taking us to participate in the lynching project that runs out of the Equal Justice Initiative. So he took us outside of the city limits of Montgomery, and quickly the paved, pretty roads turned into clay dirt streets with low-hanging trees with Spanish moss hanging from them. It was a very transitional point in time from having spent 2 days in a very state-of-the-art building with all of the luxurious things that one would need for a day of brainstorming with very high-ranking leadership to then traveling down a dirt road with no stop signs, with no real traffic signs or stoplights or anything like that. So it was a very interesting point. We passed a sign that said 1 mile to the Montgomery County Correctional Facility, and it must have been a sign of the era because it was very old, it was run down, it was made of wood, it might have been from the 40s, the 50s, or the 60s. So we get out of the bus. When we realize that we've reached our location, Bryan grabs a shovel and a glass jar and asks us to follow him. He leads us into this grassy kind of patch of land that's half swamp and like half really like very soily land, like we were sinking in as we walked, and he said, stand right here. And we stood there next to him in silence for a few minutes, and he said, where I'm standing right now is where a 16-year-old lost his life in 1945 by lynching. There were still elements left of the tree, like there were still roots and debris left of the tree that he said was used to hang him. Bryan walked us through what had happened to him. He was kidnapped. He was taken from his home in the middle of the night. He was beaten. He was hung by his neck until he suffocated. He was then set on fire and his body dismembered and scattered across the county. They were never able to find all of the parts of his body. They were never able to bury him. This gentleman was 16 years old, and his only crime was he was accused of making an advance at his overseer's wife. So Bryan allowed us to take the shovel, to dig the dirt up from the spot, and to put it into a jar that had that young man's name on it and had a prayer on the back. So in that moment of being on my knees, digging into the clay and taking this earth that was there when a young person, young enough to be my younger sister or brother, that really reminded me of how far we have still yet to go. And while we've made tremendous change as a country, we still have a long way to go because we may not be talking about guillotine executions or public lynchings, but we are still talking about who is making decisions on the loss of life, who is making decisions in terms of what punishments fit what crimes, and we're still having very, very real and hard conversations about what justice looks like to us. So it would be my recommendation and my charge to all of you as you continue on with this series and also through your lives, regardless of career path or choice, that you think hard about what justice looks like for you, what it means for you, because there are people across this country, like my colleagues here, who have made it their duty to fight and educate people about that very thing, and there are also people suffering, living at the margins, who this is not just a presentation, but their reality. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it.